This tier list is fairly similar to the last one, but some stuff has changed a little bit. From this tier list, I have the green categories in S tier. I have the kind of purple, pink, more so pink than purple categories in A, orange is B, red is C, and then D is sort of a lighter blue. In general, right now for PvE, it is, or for, sorry, for PvP and OPR, it is dominated by PvE, by like those PvE outpost building builds, just due to how long it takes to break down a gate and how much impact having a spawn can have. That being said, there are a lot of other fun builds to play as well, but if you are looking to solo carry your games, I would recommend doing this as a PvEer. And lastly, this is a solo queue tier list. If you were to do a group play tier list, basically anything is possible to be run, but in general, from a solo queue perspective, this tier list will be accurate. So starting off here, we have the PVErs. PVErs are the best class in the game by far in terms of OPR. The generally best one to go for, I believe, is Bow Greatsword, and Bow SNS is fairly close. The main reason why is they're able to do good damage to the PvE targets with the Greatsword, and Bow is the best weapon to navigate around the map with, which is why that in particular is what PvEers tend to prefer that have the most hours in the game mode. That being said, Bow SNS is also pretty good, even though those don't synergize together because the leadership that you can give to other people. The bow is mostly for the haste in this sort of setup, or you can just kind of use the SNS for the leadership and not really care about it as much. It's a bit of like a more niche one, I'd say, but it's still a little bit better than Bow Spear because Spear's damage tends to be scaling oriented. It's not like individual target bursts. And a lot of the PvE stuff, you can burst targets down in 2 to 3 hits. With the exception of like some mini bosses that are around, you don't really need to be able to do a ton of damage to a single target, which is why Greatsword and SNS tend to feel a little bit better. Greatsword Hatchet and Spear Hatchet also aren't awful options either, but Bow is just the king in terms of navigating around the map, and nothing else really comes close to it. You could also try to do this with the Rapier as well. I didn't put that on this list, but Bow Rapier is perfectly fine. It's just Rapier isn't as good of a kind of nuke individual targets oriented weapon. Greatsword tends to be a little bit better at that. SNS tends to be pretty good at that, and Spirit tends to be a little bit better than Rapier at, but Rapier could work well. Bleed Rapier is very good in PvE, but it's just in a PvP environment where you're not single target damaging like one giant boss. It tends to fall off a little bit compared to these other builds. Moving on to healers, which I would have in A tier. Healers are vital to winning OPR, and they are also, I think, the highest skill cap or carry potential role in OPR. You see a lot of the time where there's like one good healer, and that entire team is just winning, and there's not much that you can do about it. You get on the healer, they live, even though they're like 1v5. They find a way to kite and live forever, it seems like, and then people start ignoring them, and that person is single-handedly carrying OPR. That being said, there's also the other aspect where there are a lot of healers that tend to just fall over, and there is a big kind of dichotomy there of like whether you're not a good healer or not. There's a lot of that stuff where people put pressure on you and you have to be able to live. Uh, Good healers will find a way to live generally, and if you are one of those good healers, healer is by far the easiest way to carry an OPR if you are not going to be PvEing. PvEing, I'd still say, has generally more impact than an actual healer does, just because that base respawn point is just so impactful, and gates are something else, and the buffs that you can give your team just by PvEing tend to outweigh the actual heals themselves. People can tend to be able to live fairly well off of pots. That being said, healers are very nice. Rapier tends to be the best. Warhammer is weirdly good, specifically in OPR, because as a healer, people tend to play on the second level, and you could use the clear out to knock people off. I'm like half joking about this, but also not really joking at the same time that this is actually kind of annoying to deal with. Uh, like life staff with SNS is good for a similar reason, but that being said, yeah, life staff with an SNS is good for that reason as well, but tends to be a little bit less commonly ran than what I see with the Warhammer as of recent OPRs, and a lot of the healers with tons of hours will tend to have Warhammer or a Rapier that are good with either one of those. SNS is not bad as well because it can knock people off the top ropes. You can also stun individual targets that are on you, and the Leaping Strike is a good disengage ability. Ice Gauntlet is also pretty good. It's able to catch melees. You're able to provide more value to your team. I'd say Ice Gauntlet is a really good option if you want to play close to your team itself and you're not a big Rapier fan. And even that being said, Ice Gauntlet has a theory about the same survivability as a Rapier does and provides more value to your team as a whole. So maybe it is better in a best case scenario, but generally from healer convention, Rapier is the go-to. Lifestaff VG I don't think is awful from an OPR perspective, but often there are so many assassins that are roaming right now with OPR that it can make it difficult to live that more AoE healer styled build. So I would not recommend going to VG unless you are very, very proficient in it. And it in general is more of a second class oriented healer compared to other healer builds. Lastly, Life Staff with Blunderbuss I don't think is bad as well. Life Staff with Hatchet is also like not terrible, but I wouldn't say that either one of those is something that I would prefer to run. And if you are going to be healing, those weapons generally won't help your team stay alive and let you stay alive. There's kind of one or the other, and they don't have a great balance compared to some of these other options. In terms of assassins I would classify as also being an A tier where they're very dominant in terms of carry potential. The trick with the assassins is finding a way to get in and get out without getting hit, because if you get hit, you're going to get slowed, and if you get slowed, you're going to get caught, and if you get caught, you're going to die. So a lot of these builds are very low con. They could blow someone up in one hit, and they kind of skirt around the battlefield really, really fast. A lot of them tend to use Hatchet for that reason, to kind of navigate around a little bit quicker without the fear of being caught. That being said, I still think the best assassin build generally right now is Greatsword SNS. It's just a way to kind of insta one-shot someone and have enough like slow potential to chase people that are a little bit squishier. That being said, I think Hatchet is very, very close behind that. Uh, so I would recommend going either one of those depending on what playstyle that you prefer. But both those weapons are good. The main value that you get with the hatchet is you get the extra cleanse to get out of a CC. The extra shot that you live as well is helpful at times, but it generally won't be as good as it was before. But there are a lot of people like the whelps that get a lot of value out of hatchet, and it can very easily work well with the right hands. Great Sword, Great Axe, I'd think is also a pretty good assassin-oriented build. This is kind of a Disruptor Assassin hybrid build. It's better versus giant clumps than a typical assassin, but it also gets blown up a little bit more. People tend to run a little bit more con with that build for that reason. But I wouldn't really classify it as a disruptor because it can blow people up as well. And it's kind of a mixed batch worth of both of those builds. An SNS Great Axe instead of the Great Sword is also pretty good as well as an assassin build. But that being said, I think there is a big gap between a Greatsword SNS, Greatsword Hatchet, and SNS Hatchet to these other builds because you're able to drop your con significantly lower with the other builds from what I've seen, and those players tend to get more value. Lastly, SNS Spear I have as like a lower tier build to go. The problem with Spear is it's kind of scaling, and you typically want burst with this sort of setup, so it tends to not be as good in an assassin-oriented context, but can be pretty good from a disruptor-oriented context. Moving on to B tier, I would classify this as basically every ranged build that plays in OPR, just mostly due to the map design. I would say all these builds are solid. They won't single-handedly carry an OPR, but they're just generally good, and any player can kind of slap on a ranged build and will just end up getting value because you're playing in a map that is kind of wide open, not a lot of cover, and range just tends to thrive in that sort of situation. Some of these ranged builds would be something like a bow rapier. A bow rapier, I think, is generally the best ranged build. It's a little bit worse versus clumps compared to a fire staff or a blunderbuss, but it's able to do well in the single target aspect, and a lot of the times OPR does come down to single target duels, and bow is very good at single target duels. Rapier is also very good at single target duels. Put them together, and you have like one of the most single targeted, like oriented carry weapons in the game. If you exclude cheese comps from 1v1 tourneys, I think Bow Rapier has the most wins as of recent in like 1v1 tourneys, so it is very good when it comes to those, and a lot of the time you can take advantage of that. Firestaff Ice Gauntlet I think is very close behind that. This is a more nuke the clump oriented build. There's not a lot of healing in OPR, so a lot of this damage tends to stick, and it can be very scary at times. I'd say it is a lot better than it is in Wars in OPR. But if you are versus a team that has a lot of healers, Firestaff can get less value and that's where Blunderbuss can kind of come in and mop those things up, as well as Blunderbuss can peel for people in your backline. So I think both those builds are really good, but I'd still say Firestaff is generally a little bit better than Blunderbuss in OPR because the map is so open. Blunderbuss you could either run in light or medium. OPR I'd say light is a little bit preferable, but medium works as well. And this is kind of a peel slash clump nuke oriented build. It can be a little hard for the Blunderbuss to get value because the chokes are very narrow. It's hard for you to stay at a close distance and live at the same time often. But if you find a way to play around that and get on the other team's healers, you can get a lot of value. You can also peel for assassins and blow them up very easily. Both these weapons have a lot of high carry potential in OPR as well as bow. Firestaff BB is a more clump-oriented nuke style build. I think it struggles a bit in OPR because of assassins right now, but it is a solid build. Musket is still, although it is nerfed, I'd say Musket is still annoying and can at times be very good looking. But it takes the right kind of pilot. There are the musket players that hit all the shots, and there are the musket players that hit every other shot, and there's a big difference between the two, as well as the positioning is a lot more dynamic now with the fall off changes, so you can't just stand on the perch in Narnia and just shoot people all the time. You kind of have to move with your team in order to get another damage perk so that you have the accuracy and the damage output to be able to do consistent pressure. So you're playing like a little bit beyond Firestaff range, but not super far back with this oriented build now. Trapper musket is also something that's kind of interesting that you've seen more common as of recent, but it's more of a meme oriented build where you can kind of one shot particular individuals that chase you, but it's a lot less good at escaping. Bow Greatsword is also not awful, but I wouldn't say it's good. It kind of it's the best of both worlds, but also the master of none is like how I would describe it. It's a very good PvE build, but from a PvP perspective, if you just have a greatsword, you're going to get outclassed now after the greatsword nerfs, and if you just have a bow, you're going to get outclassed because you don't have a rapier. So you kind of tend to lose both aspects a little bit worse, but it is still a okay build to run from a range perspective. Bow spear is also an okay build to run from a range perspective. I think this one's a little bit better than bow greatsword, but both of them are generally a little bit weaker than the other builds on this list. Moving on to tanks. Tanks I would consider to be in a kind of a C tier category. They're good. They have carry potential, but it is a lot less. The main reason why I put bruisers over tanks is because tanks can stuff chokes in OPR, and choke stuffing is very good to hold points for a long period of time, and that's where tanks can kind of carry the most. The best tanks in OPR I would say are SNS Great Axe, SNS Warhammer, and then SNS Greatsword. SNS Great Axe, I think, is generally the best one because you have a offensive capability. You can play as a pseudo disruptor, as well as defensive capability. And grab is just the best ability in the game, so it's hard not to like it on paper. SNS Warhammer is really good at disrupting that choke and trying to keep that choke locked down. It also has a lot of lifesteal inherent built into the kit, so you can often live very long with these builds on your own. With these builds, I wouldn't necessarily go 500 con. I would probably go 200 strength because you don't really need all that con in an OPR perspective, especially if you don't have a healer. And then you can get a bit of value as sort of a hybrid tank role, which tends to get more value in a solo queue perspective than than it does in group play. So from a solo queue perspective, hybrid tanking I think is good. Group play I think pure tanking is generally is a little bit better. But that being said, this is a solo queue tier list, so I would probably recommend those hybrid tank rolls, and those weapons are very good at that. SNS Greatsword is just a build that can kind of group people up, has everything to get out, and has stand regen. Not a lot to hate about it. I wouldn't say it feels great all the time, but it generally feels good. SNS Firestaff as a Smolder Kitten sort of setup also is not that bad in OPR. A lot of people are playing fire damage, so just stacking those Smolder stacks on the other team can often carry very hard if you are built with the right team comp. That being said, if you queue into an OPR and you have 10 bows and 0 fire staffs, you probably need to switch off this build because you won't get as much value from a solo perspective as you would with a group. SNS IG is more of a group-oriented build. SNS VG is as well. Both these I don't think are good solo queue builds in OPR if you want to win, but if you want to practice for war, those are the builds that you are probably looking to play from a war perspective. Moving on to Disruptors. Disruptors, I think, are good in OPR, but they are generally less value than Assassins. The main reason is the map is a lot more open, and it's harder to get value out of the medium or heavy Disruptor-oriented builds, and it's harder to escape with those builds. That being said, a lot of Disruptor builds run SNS now, and with that, you have a lot of get-out-of-jail-free cards. You could do Leaping Strike and a Charge, for example,
and or leaping strike into relentless rush, or relentless rush into leaping strike, and it can create a lot of distance very quickly. And these builds, like in war, are still the best builds generally to contest healers since they're hard to deal with and they make it so that healers can't heal people on their team consistently. SNS Greatsword I would consider to be the best OPR disruptor build right now. SNS Great Axe being close behind. Both these builds are very good at getting in, disrupting healers. The Great Axe can also go for clumps a little bit more than the Great Sword can, and depending how you build it, could either be very nuclear oriented or can be kind of a hybrid tank role, depending on how you play it. Both these weapons I think are solid as a disruptor in OPR, and I would recommend trying them out. SNS Spear is also pretty good. This could be built also as a tank or as a pure disruptor. Both of those aspects are good. I would say if you go for a pure disruptor, just be really careful about your positioning because if you get caught with this build, it can be a little bit difficult to get out at times. The main thing is you could use your skewer to get out and you could use your leaping strike to get out. So make sure you have at least one of those up to get out of a clump at all times. SNS IG is kind of a war-oriented disruptor build that's a little bit less good in OPR, but is still a good build to try. SNS Hatchet and Greatsword Hatchet tend to be a little bit harder to uh, they're better at living, like in getting out of clumps, but if you're actually in the clump, it tends to get a little bit less value than other builds on this list. Both those builds aren't bad though. I think Disruptor in general is a decent class, but it doesn't have as much carry potential as other classes on this list. As a disruptor, you're usually responding to having to someone that has a lot of carry potential and you're trying to shut them down. And that's something that's a little bit harder in OPR when a lot of the times that other team does not have that player that is hard carrying them. So you're kind of left in the spot where you're trying to be more of an assassin as a disruptor, and at that point, it's better just to play an assassin-oriented build, which is why I have it lower on this list than something else. Moving on to Bruisers. Bruisers I would put on in D tier and OPR from a solo queue perspective. They are a very good class, don't get me wrong. But if you load into a lobby without a healer, you're just straight up not going to have a good time. And if you load into a lobby with a healer, then you have a healer on your team and they're proccing you, it's going to feel great. But from a solo queue perspective, you can't really keep track of that variable. And since it's so flip-floppy, I have to rate it very low on this list since it's just generally not good as a solo queue build. But if you're with the right army, Bruiser can be easily S tier. It's just from a solo queue perspective where you can't trust your teammates to actually help you. I don't think Bruiser tends to get as much value as other builds on this list. Great Axe Warhammer, I think, can be played in any sort of spec from a Bruiser perspective. You could play it as sort of a pseudo disruptor, pseudo Bruiser in light, or you could play it as a typical Bruiser in medium, or you could play it more as a tank in heavy. All those options kind of work to a degree. SNS SNS Great Axe, I think, is also pretty good from a Bruiser perspective. This is more of a tank-oriented Bruiser setup where you go for more of a defensive SNS style, and you try to choke stuff to a degree. So it's kind of between a tank and a Bruiser, which is why it kind of duplicates in these lists. But I think that build's also not that bad, and Great Sword is also not that bad as a Bruiser, but is more of a disruptor than a Bruiser in my opinion. If you play it as a Bruiser, I think it's a little bit worse than other builds on this list. Moving on to the last category, supports. IGVG is what I would consider to be a support. Some people have played heavy IGBB and had success with it. I tend to think that build is dated on this patch, and hard loses to Disruptors, hard loses to Bruisers, hard loses to Assassins. It basically loses to range as well. It does not have a lot of builds that it's individually good against, but if you are in a very big clump fight, it can be okay. Generally, from support wise, you want to go IGVG. I think IGVG with kind of as a util build in light tends to be the best build for OPR. That being said, as a util build, you can kind of play it in any spec. If you want to be more tank oriented, you can run it in heavy. If you want to play it on the shoulder of a bruiser, you can run it in medium. All those setups are good. And then Spike as IGVG, I think is a little bit worse off, but it's a very fun build to play. It just tends to be very hit or miss, and if you hit your shots, it could be really good. But in general, I would not recommend going it unless you're one of those players that consistently hits your shots. And with that all being said, I think just to summarize, PVE wise is the way to go if you want to win as a solo queue player, but PvE is a good aspect. Healing and Assassin is probably the next best carrying aspect. Ranged players are just generally good to have in OPR due to the map design. Tanks and Disruptors can be good if the other team meets the conditions for them being good, and then Bruisers and Supports are kind of team dependent, but if you play them right and you have a good team, they can be very good as well. And with that all being said, I'll catch you guys in the next video.